Next, we have to identify some constraints. Okay, there are some constraints in the subtype and supertype relationship. So now we have to identify those constraints. Okay, there are two constraints which are to be identified whenever there is an enhanced entity relationship diagram, which means that whenever there is a supertype subtype relationship, we have to identify these two constraints. The first constraint is known as completeness constraint. Okay, and the second constraint is disjointness constraint. So completeness constraint is whether an instance of a supertype must also be a member of at least one subtypes, or an instance of supertype can exist independently. This is the question which is to be answered through this constraint. So this constraint asks a simple question, and that is either a supertype's instance can independently exist or not, or that instance has to be an instance of one of the subtypes. This is the question, right? इसका जवाब क्या होगा? Scenario पे depend होता है. Okay? It depends upon the scenario. So based upon the possibilities, there are two rules in this constraint. First rule is known as total specialization rule, and the second rule is known as partial specialization rule. Total specialization is that an instance cannot exist independently. Okay? So this is total specialization.
Instance of supertype?
Yes. Okay? So total specialization rule is that an instance of a supertype cannot exist independently. That has to belong to at least one of the subtypes. So it is a must for an instance to be an instance of supertype that that instance has to be linked with one of the subtypes. This rule is known as total specialization rule, and this rule is represented with the help of a double line between the circle and the supertype. अभी हमने notations देखी. There was a circle, right? That was in middle of the supertype and subtypes. So उस circle से लेके जो supertype है, if there are two lines which are connecting that circle and the supertype, then those two lines show that there is total specialization, which means that an instance of the supertype cannot exist independently. If we map this concept into the object-oriented programming, there are certain scenarios where we can inherit a class, but we cannot instantiate that class. What is that? Abstract class, exactly. So this total specialization is just like an abstract class, where you can inherit the class, but you cannot instantiate that class. You cannot create instance of that class. So if there is total specialization, you cannot create instance, which means you cannot add data to the supertype independently. That data has to be connected with one of the rows of one of the subtypes, right? So the second is a partial specialization rule. And a partial specialization rule is that an instance of supertype can exist independently. So just tell me, in this case, according to the scenario, is there partial or total specialization? Notation को छोड़ दें, not depending on the notation. According to the scenario that we had three types, we had these three types, and now we have a generalized. So here we have what? Partial specialization. Why? Because we have to accommodate motorbike, right? So motorbike would be accommodated with the help of instance of vehicle. So if there is an instance of vehicle which is not associated with a car or a truck, that instance would be an instance of motorbike. So if such type of scenario is there, that we have to accommodate an instance of the super type only, then there would be partial specialization. Okay, so these are two rules, partial and total. I hope the rules are clear to everyone. Okay. So this is the notation used to represent the total specialization. These two lines, okay? Whenever there are two lines between the circle and the super type, there would be a total specialization. Okay, so in this particular case, we can have an instance of patient. Okay, so for a patient, to be a patient, it is not necessary that that patient should be an outpatient or resident patient. No, sorry, ulta bol gaya. Patient instance cannot be created, right? Because there is total specialization. Okay, so it means that for a patient, to be a patient, it is a necessity that that patient should either be an outpatient or a resident patient. There is no third patient. A patient has to be an outpatient or has to be a resident patient. Okay, so this is an example of partial specialization. Total specialization. So this is an example of partial specialization, where we can have an instance of the super type, because for a vehicle to be a vehicle, it is not necessary in this particular case that that vehicle should be a car or truck. A vehicle can be just a vehicle, and that is motorcycle, we already know. But according to the scenario, there is a provision that a vehicle can exist independently. Okay? Are you following me?
Yes, sir.
Great. So there is another rule, there is another constraint known as the disjointness constraint. Okay? The question that is asked by disjointness constraint is that an instance of a subtype, can an instance of a subtype belong to more than one subtypes or not?